There was a boy in Florence, sometime in the middle years of the 1400s, who was learning to draw a line that would not break. He worked in a room that smelled of walnut oil and ground pigments, and his hand moved across the prepared surface with a kind of singing pressure, the way a bow moves across a string. The line had to be continuous and clean. It had to describe the edge of a form without suggesting that the form was heavy. This was harder than it sounds. Most painters at that time were learning to make bodies that looked like they had weight, that stood on floors and cast shadows and occupied space the way actual bodies do. But this boy, whose name was Alessandro, but who would be called Sandro and later Botticelli, was learning something slightly different. He was learning to make bodies that hovered. His teacher was a man named Filippo Lippi, a Carmelite friar who had stopped living like a friar a long time ago. Lippi had once been employed painting an altarpiece in a convent in Prato, and while he was there he fell in love with a novice nun named Lucrezia Buddi, and convinced her to run away with him. They had 2 children together. The church eventually released them both from their vows. Lippi painted Madonnas with Lucrezia's face for the rest of his life. He was one of the most successful painters in Florence, known for a style that was tender and decorative, with figures that had soft, oval faces and elongated proportions. His compositions were busy, full of incident and ornament. He liked patterns, brocades, halos made of translucent discs that looked like dinner plates balanced on the heads of saints. Sandro came to him in the early 1460s, probably around the age of 15 or 16. It is not entirely clear why a boy from a respectable family, his father, Mariano Filippeppi, was a tanner who had done well enough to own property and hold minor civic positions, would be apprenticed to a painter. Painting was a trade, not a calling for the sons of the middle class. But Sandro was apparently a dreamy, distracted child, not suited to his father's profession, and someone must have noticed that he had a gift for drawing. So we went to Lippi's workshop, and there he learned to grind colors, to prepare panels, to lay gold leaf, to transfer a drawing onto a wall or a wooden surface using a technique called spolvero, in which you prick holes along the lines of a cartoon and then dust it with charcoal so that the design transfers in a constellation of dots. And he learned to paint the way Lippi painted, which meant he learned a kind of visual music, a rhythm of line and ornament that had very little to do with the new science of perspective, or the study of anatomy that other Florentine workshops were pursuing. Florence in the middle of the 15th century was a city obsessed with the recovery of the ancient world. Scholars were translating Greek texts that had been lost to Western Europe for 1,000 years. Architects were measuring the ruins of Roman baths and temples and trying to extract from them a set of principles, a grammar of ideal form. Sculptors were looking at fragments of antique statues and learning to carve bodies that had the weight and balance and contained energy of those ancient figures. Painters were learning perspective, the mathematical system that allowed them to construct a picture as though it were a window onto a measurable space, every object in it occupying a precise location that could be calculated and verified. The goal was to make paintings that felt as real as the world, or more precisely, to make paintings that felt as real as the world must have felt to the ancient Romans, who were imagined to have lived in a state of visual and intellectual perfection that had been lost and was now being painstakingly reconstructed. But Filippo Lippi was not especially interested in this project. He knew perspective, and he could paint a tiled floor or a receding loggia as well as anyone. But what he really cared about was grace, tenderness, the play of light on fabric, the tilt of a head, the way a Madonna's hand might rest on the Christ child's shoulder, with a touch so delicate it seemed to carry the whole weight of love and foreknowledge and resignation. He painted pictures that were emotionally direct and visually sumptuous, and if his figures did not look like Roman statues, that was fine. They looked like people caught in moments of quiet, private feeling, and that was worth more. Sandro absorbed this. He learned to paint faces that were soft and introspective, with downcast eyes and small, gentle mouths. He learned to paint drapery that moved in long, flowing lines, fabric that seemed to have a life of its own, independent of the body beneath it. He learned to love ornament, detail, the pleasure of a well-painted flower or a panel of brocade. And he learned to think of a painting not as a window onto a rational, measurable space, but as a surface on which beautiful things could be arranged in beautiful ways, a field of visual incident that the eye could move through slowly, finding one small perfection after another. He would have been in Lippi's workshop during the years when the older painter was working on his frescoes in the cathedral at Prato and later on commissions for the Medici. The Medici were the effective rulers of Florence, though they did not hold formal titles. They were bankers, and they had become so wealthy and so politically indispensable that they functioned as a kind of informal monarchy. Cosimo de' Medici, the head of the family until his death in 1464, was a careful, shrewd man who understood that power in Florence depended on the appearance of humility. He lived in a grand palace, but dressed plainly. He funded churches, libraries, monasteries, and he employed the city's best artists and architects, not as personal servants, but as honored craftsmen whose work would reflect well on the family and the city both. Lippi painted for him, and so did many others. By the time Sandro left Lippi's workshop, sometime around 1467, Cosimo was dead, and his son Piero had taken over, though Piero was in poor health and would only rule for 5 years. The real power was already shifting to Piero's son Lorenzo, who was still a teenager but who was being groomed to take his place at the center of Florentine life. Lorenzo would become the most famous Medici, the one history would call Lorenzo the Magnificent, and it was in his Florence, the Florence of the 1470s and 80s, that Sandro Botticelli would do the work that defines him now. But in 1467, Sandro was still only a young painter, recently out of his apprenticeship, trying to establish himself. He opened his own workshop, probably in the neighborhood of Ognissanti, near the Arno, and he began to take commissions. Most of his early work has been lost, or is hard to identify, but we know he was painting altarpieces, small devotional panels, portraits. He was learning to paint in his own voice, which was a version of Lippi's voice, but sharper, more linear, less soft. Where Lippi's figures were round and tender, Sandro's were taut and elegant. He had a feeling for line that was almost sculptural, a line that could define a form with absolute clarity and yet remain weightless, so that the figures he painted seemed to exist in some middle realm between the physical and the immaterial. There was a painting he made in the early 1470s, a small devotional panel showing the Madonna and Child with an angel. The Madonna has a pale oval face and lowered eyes, and the Christ Child reaches up to touch her cheek. The angel stands beside them holding a lily, and all three figures are pressed close together in a shallow space, as if the picture were not deep enough to hold them. The background is dark. The faces are luminous. The Madonna's veil is painted in thin, transparent strokes that seem to float above the surface of the panel. The whole image has a kind of hushed intensity, a feeling of something withheld or almost said. It is a small painting meant for private prayer, and it has the intimacy of a whisper. This was the kind of work he was doing in his mid-20s when he was still unknown outside of Florence, but he was also beginning to paint in a different register, one that would eventually carry him much further. He was beginning to paint subjects that were not devotional, or not entirely devotional, subjects that came from classical mythology or from the allegorical tradition that was being revived by the scholars and poets in the Medici circle. These were paintings that assumed a viewer who was educated, who knew the stories and could decode the symbols, who understood that a painting could be more than a picture of something, that it could be a kind of visual philosophy, a way of thinking made visible. This kind of painting required a different atmosphere. Florence in the 1470s was a city where a very particular kind of intellectual conversation was taking place, centered around the figure of Marsilio Ficino, a philosopher and priest who had been sponsored by Cosimo de' Medici to translate the works of Plato into Latin. Ficino was not simply a translator. He was the architect of a system of thought that came to be called Neoplatonism, a synthesis of Platonic philosophy, Christian theology, and Hermetic mysticism that was hugely influential in Lorenzo's Florence. At the heart of Ficino's system was the idea that the material world was a shadow or reflection of a higher, spiritual reality, and that beauty in the visible world was a trace of the divine beauty that could not be seen directly. To look at something beautiful was to be reminded, however faintly, of the eternal and the true. And because the human soul was imprisoned in the body, weighed down by matter and desire, the experience of beauty was always tinged with longing, a kind of ache for a home you could not quite remember but could never forget. This was the philosophy that shaped the way Lorenzo de' Medici and his circle thought about art. They collected ancient sculptures and gems, they read Virgil and Ovid, they wrote poetry that mixed classical imagery with Christian feeling, and they commissioned paintings that tried to capture this sense of the world as a place of beauty and exile both. It was in this atmosphere that Sandro began to paint pictures that had nothing to do with the practical, civic, and devotional commissions that sustained most workshops. He began to paint pictures that seemed to exist for the sake of contemplation, for the sake of a certain kind of refined, melancholy pleasure. The first of these, or the first we know about, is a painting called Primavera. It was made sometime in the late 1470s or early 1480s, probably for Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, a cousin of Lorenzo the Magnificent. It is a large painting nearly 10 feet wide, painted on a wooden panel, and it shows a scene set in a grove of orange trees. On the right side of the painting, a wind god, blue-skinned and puffing out his cheeks, is chasing a nymph who is being transformed into the figure of Flora, the goddess of flowers, who walks forward scattering roses. In the center, a woman in red, probably Venus, stands in front of a dark gap in the trees, and above her head, a small blindfolded Cupid aims his arrow downward. To the left, 3 women in transparent gowns are dancing in a circle, their hands linked, their bodies turning in a rhythm that seems both weightless and precise. At the far left, a young man in a red cloak and a winged helmet is reaching up to touch the branches of a tree. The whole scene is dense with flowers. There are more than 500 species of plants identifiable in the painting. Botanists have counted them, and the figures seem to float above the grass rather than stand on it. The light is even and diffuse, with no clear source. The space is shallow, almost flat, and the composition is organized in a frieze, like a classical relief, with each figure occupying its own vertical band. No one is entirely certain what the painting means. It has been interpreted as an allegory of spring, of love, of the soul's ascent toward the divine, of the Medici family's virtues, of the triumph of chastity, of the harmony of nature. The figures are drawn from Ovid and from Renaissance poetry, but they are arranged in a way that does not tell a story in any straightforward sense. They simply exist together, each one absorbed in their own action, and the viewer is left to wander through the composition, trying to piece together a coherence that may or may not be there. It is a painting that refuses to explain itself. What is clear is that it is beautiful in a way that feels strange and remote. The women in the painting have long, pale faces and slender necks, and their bodies are outlined with a line so fine and continuous that they seem drawn rather than painted. Their hair flows in elaborate loops and coils, as if it had its own weight and movement, unaffected by any actual breeze. Their expressions are distant, self-contained, as if they were thinking of something just beyond the edge of the picture. There is no drama, no interaction in the usual sense. Each figure is isolated within the overall composition, moving through their own private choreography. The effect is dreamlike, or more accurately, it is like a vision, something glimpsed and then half-remembered, something that feels significant without being legible. Sandro was in his mid-30s when he painted Primavera, and he was by then a recognized master with his own workshop and a steady stream of commissions. He had painted frescoes in the Sistine Chapel in Rome, working alongside Perugino, Ghirlandaio, and Rosselli, on a cycle of scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ. His contribution to the cycle included a scene of the youth of Moses and another of the punishment of the sons of Korah, and both paintings showed his gift for organizing large numbers of figures into a coherent composition, his ability to paint faces that were distinctive and expressive, and his instinct for decorative detail. But the Sistine frescoes were public commissions, designed to communicate clear theological and political messages to a broad audience. Primavera was something different. It was a painting made for a private space, probably a bedchamber or a studiolo, and it was addressed to a viewer who would have time to look at it slowly, to puzzle over its meanings, to take pleasure in its beauty, without needing to extract a message from it. This was the kind of work that Sandro was increasingly drawn to. He was still painting altarpieces and Madonnas, and he would continue to do so for the rest of his life. But the paintings that mattered most to him, the ones that seemed to have occupied his imagination most fully, were the paintings that explored this other territory, the territory of myth and allegory and ideal beauty. And the painting that stands at the center of this territory, the painting that has become the single most famous image of his career and one of the most reproduced images in the history of art, is The Birth of Venus. It was painted sometime in the middle of the 1480s, probably 1484 or 1485, again most likely for Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici. It is slightly smaller than Primavera, but still large, about 6 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and it is painted not on a wooden panel but on canvas, which was unusual for a painting of this scale and ambition. Canvas was typically used for banners or temporary decorations, not for works that were meant to last. The choice suggests that the painting was made quickly, or at least without the elaborate preparation that a panel painting would require, and there is something about the image itself that feels provisional, sketched, as if it were a study for something even larger and more finished that was never made. The composition is simple. The goddess Venus stands in the center of the picture, balanced on the edge of a large scallop shell that floats on a sea of small, rhythmic waves. She is naked, or nearly naked. Her long blonde hair falls across her body in a way that covers her without quite concealing her, and her right hand is lifted to her breast in a gesture that is both modest and self-aware. To her left, 2 figures are flying above the water, their bodies intertwined, blowing the shell toward the shore. These are Zephyr, the west wind, and his companion, probably the nymph Chloris. Their cheeks are puffed out, and their bodies are foreshortened and energetic, and from their mouths comes a visible breath, painted as a series of curving white lines that seem to push the shell forward. The air around them is full of roses, painted as simple, loose blossoms that tumble through the sky. On the right side of the painting, a woman stands on the shore, reaching out to drape a cloak embroidered with flowers over Venus's shoulders. She is probably one of the Horae, the goddesses of the seasons, and she is dressed in a white gown that flows around her body in long, elegant folds. Behind her is a grove of trees, dark and stylized, and behind Venus the sea stretches out to a low horizon, flat and pale and empty. The painting is strange in almost every way. The figures are not naturalistic. Venus does not stand on the shell so much as hover above it, and her proportions are odd. Her neck is too long, her shoulders slope downward, her left arm is slightly too short. Her face is pale and expressionless, with a small closed mouth and wide blank eyes that look out at nothing in particular. She is not a woman. She is an idea of a woman, an ideal form that has been drawn and then tinted with color, as if the painter were more interested in the outline than in the substance. The waves of the sea are painted as a repeating pattern of small, V-shaped marks that have no variation or depth. The trees in the background are simplified into flat shapes, and the sky is a single, even tone. The whole picture is organized on the surface, like a tapestry or a fresco, with no real illusion of space or volume. The light is even and directionless. There are no shadows. And yet the painting is completely absorbing. It draws you in and holds you, not because it looks like the world, but because it looks like a distillation of the world, like a dream of the world in which everything inessential has been removed, and what remains is only the outline of beauty, the shape of an idea that cannot be spoken, but only shown. Venus does not move or gesture or react. She simply is, standing in a perfect, arrested moment, as if she had been arriving at this shore forever and would continue to arrive forever, and nothing would ever change. The painting is based on a passage in a long poem by Angelo Poliziano, a poet and scholar in Lorenzo de' Medici's circle, who describes the birth of Venus in language that is itself based on ancient sources. But Sandro did not illustrate the poem. He used it as a starting point and then made something that has the same atmosphere as the poem, but exists in its own terms. The painting feels literary, not in the sense that it tells a story, but in the sense that it seems to be about meaning, about reference, about the layering of associations and symbols that would have been legible to the painting's original audience. Venus is not just the goddess of love. She is an image of divine beauty descending into the material world. The sea she rises from is the element of generation, of fertility and creation. The winds that blow her to shore are the forces of desire that move the soul toward the good. The cloak that the Hora holds out is the garment of earthly life, which will both clothe and conceal the divine beauty that Venus represents. All of this is implied, encoded, available to a viewer who knows the references and who has been trained in the habit of reading images as allegories. But the painting does not require you to know any of this. It works even if you cannot decode it. It works because it is beautiful, because the rhythms of its composition are so precise and so calming, because the figure of Venus, for all her strangeness, is so utterly resolved, so completely what she is. There is something in the way she stands, or floats, with her weight shifted onto one leg and her head tilted slightly, her hand at her breast, and her hair falling in long, looping curves, that feels like the answer to a question the painting has not asked. She is not sensual. She is not warm or inviting or alive in any ordinary way. She is remote, ethereal, more like a statue of a goddess than a goddess, and this remoteness is the point. She is an image of beauty that exists at a distance from the viewer, always just out of reach, and the melancholy that saturates the painting, the sense of something lost or longed for, comes from this distance, from the gap between the ideal and the real. Sandro painted this at the height of his career, in his late 30s or early 40s, when he was one of the most sought-after painters in Florence. He had a large workshop, and he employed assistants who helped him prepare panels, mix colors, fill in backgrounds, paint repetitive details, but the best of his work from this period feels entirely personal, as if no one else could have made it. There is a nativity he painted in the mid-1480s that shows the Christ child lying on the ground in front of a crumbling stable, surrounded by Mary and Joseph and a crowd of angels, and the angels are painted with such delicacy, their wings so finely detailed and their gestures so graceful, that they seem to belong to a different order of being than the human figures around them. There is a series of small tondi, circular paintings showing the Madonna and Child, and in each one the figures are pressed close together in a shallow space, the Madonna's face bent down toward the Child, and the whole composition has a centripetal energy, as if everything were being drawn inward toward the center of the circle, toward the Child's face. There is a portrait of a young man holding a medal, and the man's face is painted with extraordinary precision, every line and plane defined, and yet there is something withheld in his expression, something guarded, as if he were holding back the part of himself that could not be painted. And there are the late mythological paintings, the works that seem to have no function except to be looked at, to be contemplated. There is a small painting called Pallas and the Centaur, which shows a woman in an elaborate gown decorated with olive branches, holding a halberd and resting her hand on the head of a centaur, who looks up at her with an expression of confusion or submission. It is not clear what the painting means. Pallas, the goddess of wisdom, subduing the bestial nature of the centaur perhaps, or reason triumphing over passion. But the image is striking, the woman's postures so upright, and the centaurs so bent, and the space between them charged with a tension that is both allegorical and erotic. There is another painting called Venus and Mars, which shows the goddess of love reclining beside the sleeping figure of Mars, the god of war, while a group of small satyrs play with Mars's armor. Venus is awake, her eyes open, her expression calm and knowing, while Mars is sprawled out in a deep, unguarded sleep. The painting has been read as an allegory of love's triumph over violence, or of the power of beauty to disarm aggression. But it is also simply a picture of two bodies in a landscape, one awake and one asleep, and the contrast between them is enough. These paintings were made for a very small audience. They were private commissions, intended for the rooms of cultivated patrons who would have understood the references and appreciated the subtlety of the execution. They were not meant to instruct or inspire in the way that an altarpiece was. They were meant to give pleasure, to provoke thought, to create a space for contemplation, and they represent a mode of painting that was almost unique to Sandro in this period. Other painters were working in a more naturalistic style, influenced by the recent discoveries in anatomy and perspective, trying to make pictures that looked like convincing illusions of three-dimensional space. But Sandro was moving in the opposite direction, toward a style that was more linear, more decorative, more openly artificial. His figures did not inhabit space, they occupied surfaces. They were drawn before they were painted, and the line remained visible, defining the edges of forms in a way that emphasized their status as images, as things made by a hand on a flat surface. This was not a regression, it was a choice. Sandro knew how to paint in a more naturalistic way. His early works and his altarpieces prove that, but he chose not to, or he chose to do so only when the commission required it. In his mythological paintings he was after something else, something that the pursuit of naturalism would have obscured. He was trying to paint ideal beauty, and ideal beauty, in the Neoplatonic sense, was not something that could be found in the actual world. It was something that had to be imagined, constructed, distilled from multiple sources, and then rendered in a form that was visibly artificial, visibly ideal. The bodies in his paintings were not meant to look like bodies you could touch. They were meant to look like bodies you could only see, like forms glimpsed in a vision or a dream, and the linearity of his style, the way his figures seemed to float rather than stand, was a way of signaling their status as images of a higher reality. But even as he was painting these images of ideal beauty, something was shifting in Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici, who had ruled the city with a combination of political skill, cultural patronage, and personal charisma, died in 1492 at the age of 43. His son Piero took over, but Piero lacked his father's judgment and his father's touch. In 1494, the French king Charles VIII invaded Italy, and Piero, in a panic, made a series of concessions that infuriated the Florentines. He was expelled from the city, and the Medici rule, which had lasted for 60 years, came to an abrupt end. Into the vacuum stepped Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar who had been preaching in Florence for several years. Savonarola was a charismatic and terrifying figure, a man who believed that the church was corrupt, that Florence was corrupt, that the whole world was corrupt, and that only a radical purification could save it. He preached repentance, self-denial, the renunciation of worldly pleasures. He railed against the vanity of wealth, the sinfulness of art, the idolatry of beauty. He called for the burning of books, paintings, mirrors, cosmetics, anything that distracted the soul from God. And the people of Florence, shaken by the political upheaval and frightened by the violence of the times, listened. In 1497, Savonarola organized what came to be known as the Bonfire of the Vanities, a public burning of objects deemed sinful or frivolous. People brought their possessions to the Piazza della Signoria, books of poetry, decks of cards, elaborate clothing, musical instruments, and paintings, and piled them onto a great pyramid-shaped pyre, which was then set alight. It was a kind of collective penance, a renunciation of the city's own culture. And among the people who participated, or who are said to have participated, was Sandro Botticelli. It is not certain that he actually burned his own paintings. The story comes from a later source and may not be reliable. But it is certain that something changed in him during these years. The Florence of Savonarola was not the Florence of Lorenzo de' Medici. The intellectual atmosphere that had sustained Sandro's mythological paintings, the atmosphere of Neoplatonic philosophy and humanist learning and refined aesthetic pleasure, had evaporated. The Medici were gone. The scholars and poets who had formed Lorenzo's circle were scattered or silenced. The city was in the grip of a religious revival that was suspicious of beauty, suspicious of art, suspicious of anything that seemed to place human achievement above divine grace. Sandro had always been a pious man. His paintings of the Madonna and Child are full of genuine devotion, and even his mythological works have a kind of reverence built into them, a sense that beauty is holy, that the visible world is a manifestation of the divine. But Savonarola's preaching must have troubled him, must have raised questions about the nature of his work. Was it sinful to paint Venus, to make images of pagan gods, to take pleasure in the grace of a line or the fall of drapery? Was the pursuit of beauty a distraction from the pursuit of God, or was it a way of approaching God? These were not idle questions. They were questions that went to the heart of what Sandro had spent his life doing. He continued to work, but his work changed. In the late 1490s and the early 1500s, the last decade and a half of his life, he painted very few mythological subjects. He returned to religious themes almost exclusively, and the paintings he made in this period are darker, more austere, more visibly troubled than anything he had done before. There is a Nativity, dated 1501, that is unlike any of his earlier nativities. It is painted on canvas, and the composition is crowded and chaotic, with angels and shepherds and demons all pressed together in a shallow, unstable space. The figures are elongated and awkward. Their gestures exaggerated, and the whole scene has a frantic, almost hysterical energy. At the top of the painting, a group of angels dance in a circle, holding hands and wearing crowns and branches, and they are painted in gold against a flat gold sky, as if the painting had reverted to a medieval style, as if the Renaissance had never happened. At the bottom of the painting, there is an inscription in Greek, written in Sandro's own hand, that refers to the apocalypse, to the troubles of Italy, to the expectation of the end times. It is a painting made in a state of fear and hope, a vision of redemption that feels like it is being shouted rather than whispered. There is another painting, a crucifixion with St. Jerome, that shows Christ on the cross in the center of a rocky, barren landscape, with the kneeling figure of Jerome at the base of the cross. The sky is dark. The landscape is empty. Christ's body is gaunt and twisted, and the whole painting has a mood of desolation, of utter abandonment. It is as far as you can get from the grace and lightness of the birth of Venus. It is as if Sandro had turned his back on beauty, or as if he had come to believe that beauty without suffering was a lie. He continued to run his workshop, but his style was increasingly out of fashion. The younger generation of painters, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, were working in a new mode, one that emphasized monumental figures, dramatic compositions, a sense of volume and weight and physical presence that made Sandro's linear, decorative style look old-fashioned. He still received commissions, but fewer of them, and many of the commissions he did receive were for small, private devotional works rather than for the large public altarpieces that brought prestige and income. He was no longer at the center of Florentine artistic life. He was becoming a figure of the past. Savonarola was executed in 1498, burned at the stake in the same piazza where he had burned the vanities, and Florence gradually returned to a more moderate political and cultural climate. The Medici would eventually return to power. But Sandro did not return to his earlier manner. He did not paint another Venus. He seems to have internalized Savonarola's critique, or at least to have been marked by it. The late works are haunted, not by classical mythology, but by visions of judgment and redemption, by the weight of sin and the hope of grace. He lived until 1510, which means he lived into his mid-60s, an old man by the standards of the time. There's very little documentation of his last years. He seems to have withdrawn from public life, to have become isolated, possibly impoverished. Giorgio Vasari, the 16th-century biographer who is the main source of information about most Renaissance artists, says that Sandro was a follower of Savonarola, and that he gave up painting in his last years and died in poverty and obscurity. Vasari's accounts are not always reliable, but there is something in the late works that suggests he was not entirely wrong. There is a sense of a man who had lost his bearings, who was trying to find his way back to something he had once believed in but could no longer reach. His last securely dated work is the Nativity from 1501, and after that the record goes quiet. He may have continued to paint, but if he did, the works have not survived or have not been identified. He died on May 17, 1510, and he was buried in the Church of Ognissanti, in the neighborhood where he had lived and worked for most of his life. There is a plaque marking the location of his grave, but the grave itself is unmarked. He left behind a body of work that was admired by his contemporaries, but that did not fit easily into the narrative of Renaissance art as it came to be told. He was not a pioneer of perspective like Masaccio, or a universal genius like Leonardo, or a master of monumental form like Michelangelo. He was something stranger and harder to categorize, a painter of ideal beauty who had turned away from beauty, a maker of graceful, weightless figures who had ended his career painting visions of the apocalypse, and then he was forgotten. Not immediately, but gradually, over the course of the 16th century. His style was too linear, too decorative, too archaic for the taste of the High Renaissance and the Baroque. His mythological paintings were admired in a limited way, but they were not seen as major achievements. His religious works were dismissed as old-fashioned. Vasari, writing in the 1550s, praised Sandro's early work but criticized his late style, and his account set the tone for centuries of neglect. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Sandro's name had almost disappeared from the historical record. His paintings were attributed to other artists, or simply forgotten. The Birth of Venus, which is now one of the most famous images in Western art, was barely mentioned in the literature of the period. It hung in the Medici collections, but it was not considered an important work. It was just an odd, old-fashioned painting of a mythological subject, the kind of thing that a cultivated person might find charming but would not take seriously. The rediscovery of Sandro Botticelli began in the 19th century, and it was driven by a particular set of cultural and aesthetic concerns that had more to do with the 19th century than with the 15th. The Romantic movement had created a taste for the medieval and the primitive, for art that was sincere and emotionally direct rather than technically accomplished and intellectually sophisticated. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of English painters and poets, looked back to the Italian art of the 14th and 15th centuries as a model of purity and spiritual seriousness, and they saw in Sandro's work a kindred spirit. They loved his linearity, his lack of interest in naturalism, his focus on beauty as an ideal rather than as a physical fact. They saw him as an artist who had resisted the corruption of the High Renaissance, who had stayed true to a more authentic, more spiritual vision of art. This was a misreading, or at least a partial reading, but it was a productive one. It brought Sandro back into view. By the mid-19th century, his paintings were being studied, written about, and imitated. The Birth of Venus, in particular, became an icon of aesthetic beauty, reproduced in engravings and photographs, cited in poems and essays, absorbed into the visual vocabulary of European culture. It was seen as the perfect image of the Renaissance, of a lost world of harmony and grace, even though it was in many ways atypical of the Renaissance, a work that stood apart from the main currents of 15th century art. The 20th century's view of Sandro was more complicated. Art historians began to understand his work in its original context, to see it as part of the Medici court culture and the Neoplatonic philosophy that shaped that culture. They reconstructed the intellectual frameworks that informed his mythological paintings, and they placed him within the broader history of Florentine art, not as an outsider or a mystic, but as a successful, well-connected professional who was responding to the demands and opportunities of his moment. They also began to pay more attention to his late works, to the dark, troubled paintings of the Savonarola period, and to see in them not a decline or a failure but a different kind of achievement, a wrestling with questions of faith and doubt that was as serious and as ambitious as anything he had done in his prime. But the popular image of Sandro remained focused on the birth of Venus and the other mythological paintings, and on the idea of him as the painter of ideal beauty. The image of Venus rising from the sea became so ubiquitous, so endlessly reproduced and parodied and referenced, that it almost ceased to be a painting and became instead a symbol, a shorthand for beauty, for the Renaissance, for art itself. And in the process, something of the strangeness of the original image was lost. The Venus in Sandro's painting is not warm or inviting. She is remote, almost cold, and the painting as a whole has a mood of melancholy and distance that is hard to reconcile with the celebratory way it has been used in popular culture. The painting is not a triumph. It is a vision, and visions are always tinged with loss, with the knowledge that what you are seeing is not fully present, that it exists at a remove from the world you inhabit. What does the birth of Venus actually show? A goddess arriving at the shore, about to step from the shell onto the land, about to be clothed and welcomed into the world of time and matter. The moment the painting captures is a threshold, a transition from one state of being to another. Venus is neither fully in the sea nor fully on the land. She is suspended between, and the painting holds her there, prevents the transition from completing itself. She will never quite arrive. The cloak will never quite settle on her shoulders. The shell will never quite touch the shore. The painting is an image of beauty that is always arriving and never arriving, always present and never present, and this is the source of its melancholy. It is a painting about longing, about the gap between the ideal and the real, about the way beauty moves us precisely because we cannot possess it, cannot hold it, cannot make it stay. This is what Sandro understood, or what his paintings suggest he understood. Beauty, in the Neoplatonic sense, was not something you could grasp. It was a trace, a sign, a pointer toward something beyond itself. To make an image of beauty was to make an image of that pointing, that gesture toward the transcendent, and the image itself had to remain incomplete, provisional, weightless, so that it did not become an object of possession, but remained a vehicle of longing. This is why his figures float. This is why they are outlined rather than modeled, why they exist on surfaces rather than in spaces. They are not meant to be real. They are meant to be images of the real, images that acknowledge their own status as images and that use that status to create a different kind of emotional effect, one that depends on distance and deferral rather than on presence and immediacy. He painted this way for about 15 years, from the late 1470s to the early 1490s, and in that period he made some of the most beautiful and most mysterious paintings of the Renaissance. And then the world changed, and he changed with it, or tried to. The late works suggest a man who was trying to reconcile his gift for beauty with a growing conviction that beauty was not enough, that it was perhaps even a temptation, a distraction from the hard, necessary work of salvation. He did not resolve this tension. He lived with it, and it is visible in the paintings, in the way the late nativities are both beautiful and tormented, both graceful and anguished. There is a drawing that survives from his last years, a preparatory study for an illustration of Dante's Divine Comedy. He made a series of these illustrations, more than 100 of them, working on large sheets of parchment, drawing with a fine pen and then adding delicate washes of color. The drawings were never published in his lifetime, and they were only rediscovered in the 19th century. They are extraordinary works, full of invention and detail, and a kind of restless energy that is absent from his panel paintings. In the drawings, he seems freer, less burdened by the expectations of a commission or the weight of a theological program. He moves through Dante's three realms, hell, purgatory, paradise, with an imagination that is both visual and literary, finding forms for things that are almost impossible to depict: the circles of hell, the mountain of purgatory, the spheres of heaven. The figures in the drawings are elongated and weightless, just like the figures in his paintings, and they float through spaces that are barely defined, spaces that are more conceptual than physical. The drawings are a late flowering of his gift for line, for the way a line can define a form and also set it free, can give it shape without giving it weight. The drawing that stands out is one of the final scenes, an illustration of Dante's vision of the Empyrean, the highest level of paradise, where the poet sees the souls of the blessed arranged in the form of a great rose, tier upon tier of luminous figures gazing toward the light of God at the center. Sandro drew this as a series of concentric circles, with the figures seated in rows, their faces turned inward, and at the center a blank space, an absence that is also the source of all light. It is a drawing about structure, about order, about the idea that the universe is arranged in a pattern that can be seen and understood if you stand at the right distance. But it is also a drawing about longing, about the way the souls in the rows are separated from the light they gaze at, about the way they remain distinct and individual even as they participate in a collective vision. They are together, but they are also alone, each one absorbed in their own experience of the divine, and the drawing captures this paradox, this sense of union and separation existing at the same time. He was an old man when he made this drawing, living in a Florence that had moved on from the world he had known, working on a project that no one had commissioned and that would not be seen by anyone until long after his death. He was drawing for himself, or for Dante, or for the sake of making something beautiful and true. And the drawing suggests that he had not given up on beauty, that he still believed in the power of a line to make visible what could not otherwise be seen. But the beauty in the late drawings is different from the beauty in the early mythological paintings. It is more austere, more abstract, less concerned with the surface pleasures of ornament and detail. It is a beauty that has been tested, that has been passed through fire and come out refined, essential, stripped down to the line itself. He died before he could finish the project, and the drawings were left unbound, loose sheets that were scattered and then gradually reassembled by collectors and scholars. They are now in museums, and they are recognized as one of the great achievements of his career, but they were not known in his own time, and they did not influence the way his work was understood for centuries afterward. They are a private work, a work made in solitude and obscurity, and they suggest a different Sandro than the one we think we know, not the painter of Venus, but the illustrator of Dante, not the maker of graceful, weightless forms, but the explorer of structure and order, and the soul's ascent. What remains when you look at his work now, all of it, the early altarpieces and the mythological paintings and the late visions and the Dante drawings, is a sense of an artist who is deeply divided, who is drawn to beauty and troubled by it, who was drawn to beauty and troubled by it, who wanted to make images of the ideal, and who knew that the ideal could never be made present, could only be suggested, hinted at, longed for. There is a melancholy that runs through all of his best work, a sadness that is not the same as pessimism or despair, but that is closer to what the Neoplatonists would have called the soul's exile, the knowledge that we are not at home in the world, that the beauty we see here is only a shadow of the beauty we have lost, and will one day, perhaps, regain. This is why his paintings feel the way they do. This is why they are so absorbing and so unsettling, so graceful and so strange. They are images of longing, images made by someone who believed that the visible world was a veil over something invisible, and that the task of the artist was not to tear away the veil, but to make it beautiful, to make it prettiful, to make it transparent, to make it a medium through which the light of the divine could shine, however faintly. He spent his life trying to do this, and he succeeded in ways that are still mysterious, still hard to put into words. The birth of Venus is the most famous result of this effort, but it is not the only one. The whole body of his work, from the earliest Madonnas to the last Dante drawings, is an extended meditation on the nature of beauty and the limits of representation, on what can be shown and what can only be pointed toward, and he remains elusive. There is very little documentary evidence about his inner life, about what he thought or felt or believed in any direct sense. The paintings are the evidence, and they do not speak plainly. They offer images, visions, forms that are beautiful and enigmatic, and they leave it to the viewer to interpret, to respond, to feel whatever it is that these images provoke. The tendency has been to see him either as the painter of pagan joy, the maker of Venuses and Floras and dancing graces, or as the painter of religious anxiety, the follower of Savonarola, who renounced the world and turned to visions of the apocalypse. But he was both, or he was neither, or he was something more complicated than either label allows. He was a painter who loved beauty and who was afraid of it, who believed in the ideal and who knew that the ideal was always out of reach, who spent his life making images of things that could not be seen and could not be held and could not be possessed. This is what the paintings say. If they say anything, they say that beauty is real, but that it is not here. They say that we are exiles, pilgrims, people who have lost something and are trying to find our way back to it. They say that art is a way of marking this distance, of making it visible, of turning it into something that can be contemplated and even, in some way, loved. And they say that the line, the simple act of drawing a line, is enough to do this, that you do not need weight or volume or naturalism or drama, that all you need is the grace of a line and the patience to follow it, to let it describe a form that floats rather than stands, that hovers rather than lands, that remains always in the moment of arrival, always on the threshold, always about to become something. It will never quite become something. He understood this, or his hand understood it, and the paintings he made in that understanding are among the most beautiful and most haunting images in Western art. They were forgotten for centuries, and then they were remembered, and then they were absorbed into the popular imagination in a way that has both honored them and obscured them. The birth of Venus is everywhere now, reproduced on posters and postcards and coffee mugs, used in advertisements and parodies and homages, and in the process it has become a cliché, a symbol of art and beauty that has lost much of its original strangeness. But the painting itself, if you stand in front of it in the Uffizi in Florence, is not a cliché. It is a mystery. It is a vision of a goddess who is not quite present, who is arriving but never arrives, who is beautiful but also remote, who looks out at nothing with an expression that is both blank and infinitely sad. And the sadness is not incidental. It is the whole point. It is what makes the painting more than a decorative image, more than an illustration of a myth. It is what makes it a work of art, a thing made by a hand that understood something about beauty and loss and the distance between them. Sandro Botticelli spent his life painting that distance, and the paintings he made are still there, still waiting, still offering their strange, quiet vision of a world that is always just beyond reach. They are paintings to look at slowly, to let yourself be absorbed by, to fall asleep to in the sense that you let go of the need to understand them fully, and you simply let them be what they are, which is beautiful and elusive and finally ungraspable, like beauty itself. They are paintings made by someone who knew that the ideal could not be captured but who kept trying anyway, who kept drawing the line, who kept making the forms, who kept painting the faces of goddesses and madonnas and angels and dancers, all of them hovering in their shallow spaces, all of them waiting for something that will not come, all of them caught in the moment of arrival that will never complete itself. They are images of longing, and they teach you, if you let them, to love the longing more than the arrival, to find in the distance itself a kind of grace. And so the story of Sandro Botticelli is the story of a painter who made beauty and who was undone by it, or who was undone by the world's response to it, or who was undone by his own response to it, and who ended his life in obscurity, still making lines, still trying to see the forms that could not be seen. He died in 1510, and his work was forgotten, and then it was remembered, and now it is everywhere and nowhere, famous and misunderstood, loved and reduced, present and absent, just like the goddess in his most famous painting, who stands on her shell in the middle of the sea, about to arrive and never arriving, about to be clothed and never clothed, about to become part of the world and always remaining just outside it, always at the threshold, always in the space between one thing and another, always floating,